Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 7, The Emperor is Dead. Long live Odovacar, King of Italy, first and last of his name. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the system of orderly barbarian settlement proved its value when the Goths and the Burgundians joined Roman troops to defeat Attila. When Attila died a year later, his coalition soon broke apart. As the architect of the system, Aetius probably expected a reward from Emperor Valentinian, but was assassinated instead. Valentinian was murdered soon after, which enabled Maximus, a very ambitious senator, to declare himself emperor. However, Maximus provoked an invasion by the Vandal king Gaiseric, who sacked Rome. Angry citizens then murdered Maximus, so another senator, Avitus, made himself emperor with the support of the Goths, who were allowed to expand into Hispania. Unfortunately for Avitus, the Goths proved unwilling to fight for him, so he was killed by the generals Majorian and Ricimer. Majorian became emperor, but was killed by his generalissimo Ricimer after an attempt to invade North Africa failed. Tired of Ricimer's independent nature, the Eastern emperor nominated Anthemius, an Eastern noble, as Western emperor and gave him an army. That army ensured that the Goths and the Burgundians acknowledged Anthemius as emperor, although it is unlikely that they suddenly started to send part of their tax revenue to Rome. Still, they probably shelved any plans for expansion, at least temporarily. So the remaining Gallic Roman landowners in the region probably breathed a sigh of relief. However, this pause in expansion merely stopped the bleeding. If Anthemius wanted to restore energy to the Western Roman Empire, then he needed to regain territory. Where would he try first? Gaul, Hispania, or North Africa? Yes, the correct answer is North Africa, which offered the greatest financial return by far. The tax revenue from North Africa could fund an enlarged Roman army that could push the Goths and the Burgundians into smaller enclaves and restore imperial control to much of Hispania. Admittedly, there was a treaty with Carthage, but it had been signed decades earlier when Aetius had feared a Hun invasion. Moreover, Gaiseric, king of the Vandals and Alans, routinely raided Sicily, so an invasion would have numerous benefits. Actually, there was another factor. Remember the widow of Emperor Valentinian and her 2 daughters had returned to Carthage with Gaiseric after the Vandal king had sacked Rome? The eldest, Eudocia, had married Gaiseric's son Huneric as planned, but her mother Eudocia and her younger sister Placidia had been allowed to travel to Constantinople, where Placidia had married a Roman senator named Anicus Olybrius in 462. Gaiseric clearly approved of the marriage, since he was openly pushing for Olybrius to become Western Emperor, which would elevate the status of Gaiseric's dynasty, since Huneric's brother-in-law would be an emperor. Actually, Gaiseric's blatant desire to influence the imperial succession had unintended consequences. Leo, the Eastern Roman emperor, may have been happy to see a rival move away, but it was in his interest to reconquer North Africa. Hopefully, Anthemius would stop the Vandal raids and better an Eastern noble sitting on the throne than Gaiseric's candidate. So he supported Anthemius with a monstrous amount of gold that paid for a fleet of over 1,000 ships. Gaiseric was determined to resist, and he had a sizable fleet with experienced captains. Even so, the imperial fleet reached a landing spot somewhere in modern Tunisia when the Vandal fleet arrived. Unwilling to fight a much larger fleet, the Vandals simply launched fireships, using their greater knowledge of the winds along the coast to pick a time when the wind would drive the fireships directly into the Roman fleet, which was stuck because of the wind. Once the fireships had damaged part of the fleet, the Vandals swept in and attacked the disorganized imperial ships. The exact number of sunk Roman ships is unknown, but it was not small, and each destroyed ship meant the deaths of many, if not all, of the troops on the ship. Once again, a failed attempt to conquer North Africa had weakened an emperor's fragile grip on power, and this failure would have consequences in Gaul. When Euric pushed his brother's corpse off the throne, he had planned to adopt a more aggressive approach towards the empire, but had paused to take the measure of the new emperor. Anthemius had been a capable leader in the Eastern Roman Empire, but he was viewed as an outsider by the remaining aristocrats in Gaul and Italy because he was an outsider. If his campaign against the Vandals in 468 had succeeded, he would have gained more influence in Rome. But it was an embarrassing, expensive disaster. Realizing that he did not have to fear a Roman army, Euric expanded north, gaining control of the cities of Tours and Bourges. Actually, he would have advanced further north, but the remaining Roman army in the region allied with a large band of Franks under Childeric. Fine. Euric could expand in other directions, marching southeast towards Arles, the capital of what was left of Roman-controlled Gaul, what became Provence. A Roman army was sent to block him, but it was defeated. After several years of exhausting sieges, Euric had gained control of the cities of Arles and Marseille. Actually, Euric had rivals in Gaul, namely the Burgundians, but they were weaker and were unable to gain as much territory. In fact, Euric's expansion was largely the result of his success in luring prominent Gallic Romans to join his army. Honestly, this successful headhunting should not be a surprise. Local commanders would have been dealing with the Goths for decades, and their families would have known them for a couple of generations. Some of the older commanders would have remembered fighting Attila with them. Honestly, younger commanders would have probably only had a dim memory of a functioning imperial presence in Gaul. So, they could accept a generous offer with a high position and a large signing bonus, or fight, probably lose, and see their families' lands burned. They chose option A. Moreover, Euric knew that he had to govern a huge territory, so he intended to keep the existing structure of governors and cities in place. Just the tax revenue would go to him. In fact, he needed as many Roman administrators to join him as possible in order to collect the taxes. Finally, the landed elite had little choice since their wealth was mostly in land, so they had little wealth that could be easily transported. Having arrived more recently, the Burgundians proved to be less successful in this area, although they did attract some Roman landowners and military commanders as well. The empire should have put up more resistance, but it was preoccupied with internal problems in Italy. Ricimer had welcomed Anthemius, or had pretended to welcome him because he came with an army, but the defeat in 468 greatly weakened him. Then Anthemius' son had died along with much of his remaining troops while fighting the Goths in 471. So Ricimer decided that it was time for another change at the top. Ricimer laid siege to Anthemius in Rome for months until the city surrendered and Anthemius was killed. So, who would succeed Anthemius? Remember, Ricimer had accepted that he could not rule due to his ethnic heritage. Well, Geiseric's candidate Olybrius had been sent from Constantinople as a mediator between Ricimer and Anthemius. Clearly, he had not succeeded, but he was in the right place at the right time, so Olybrius became emperor while Anthemius was still stuck in Rome. Ricimer himself died roughly a month after Anthemius was killed. It is a good question whether Olybrius could have restored stability, but he died in November. Wow. That is a lot of deaths in a short period of time. So the question is, who would become generalissimo and who would become emperor? Ricimer's nephew Gundobad had succeeded his uncle as the power behind the throne, and he selected a senior officer in the guards, Glycerius, as the next emperor on March 3rd, 473. Clearly, Gundobad did not have a high opinion of the Western Empire's prospects. When his father, the king of the Burgundians, died sometime in late 473 or early 474, he gave up his position in Rome and returned home, even though he would have to share the Burgundian kingdom with his three brothers. Well, there was an opening for a generalissimo, so Julius Nepos, the governor of Dalmatia, received the approval of Constantinople and nothing else. Still, Glycerius was quickly persuaded to resign, and Nepos declared himself to be emperor. In case you have lost track, Nepos was the 7th person to become emperor since Valentinian's assassination roughly 20 years earlier. However, he failed to win the support of the generals, and one of those generals, Orestes, drove him out of Italy within a year. Since the position of generalissimo was vacant again, Orestes appointed himself generalissimo. Interesting. Orestes had been a follower of Attila. After Attila's death and the collapse of his coalition, Orestes had ended up serving the Romans. Believing that he lacked the genealogical pedigree to be emperor, Orestes appointed his 16-year-old son Romulus emperor. In theory, this promotion would have needed the approval of the Eastern emperor, but Leo had lost most of his fleet in North Africa and had been forced to agree to another treaty with the Vandals in 474. Well, if the son of a general could become emperor, then another general could replace him. Odovacar, a leader of a tribe that had entered the Roman military, marched against Ravenna and defeated Orestes on September 2nd, 476. Orestes was executed, and Romulus Augustus was forced to abdicate. Romulus Augustus is known as the last Roman emperor, although he was merely a figurehead. In a way, it is fitting that the last emperor was a teenaged figurehead who had ruled for less than a year, since power had been concentrated in the generalissimo for decades. Actually, Odovacar's backstory is interesting. Odovacar's father had served under Attila along with Orestes. When Attila's coalition fell apart, several tribes realized that they were now too weak to simply take whatever they wanted. Since they wanted regular meals, they joined the Roman army. Or rather, they became independent contractors employed by the empire. Again, if the empire had been functioning, they probably would have concluded that regular, if small payments were preferable to the risk of destruction in battle. However, the empire was not functioning, so Odovacar had decided to make the shift from independent military contractor to independent ruler. Resisting the temptation to call himself emperor, or perhaps recognizing that there was no Western Roman Empire anyway, Odovacar sent the imperial crown and cloak to Constantinople. Basically a formal statement that the position of emperor was no longer needed following the downsizing of the Western Empire. Honestly, the Western Roman Empire had largely ceased to exist as an entity by then. During the century between 376 and 476, the Western Empire had abandoned Britain and had lost control of North Africa, almost all of Hispania, and most of Gaul. It may seem strange that Odovacar declared himself king and did not make any effort to win the approval of the Eastern Emperor, but the decision makes sense when you consider his perspective. He had served as an independent military contractor, but more important, his role models were other barbarian kings, namely Gaiseric in North Africa and Euric in Gaul. Odovacar must have known that there was no chance that the Eastern Emperor would consider him a fellow emperor, even a junior emperor, and the track record of usurpers in the West probably did not inspire confidence. So, King Odovacar. There is a nice symbolism with the dates. In 376, Emperor Valens allowed a large group of Goths to pass through the Danube frontier of the empire. 100 years later, Emperor Romulus Augustus was deposed by Goths, becoming the last Roman emperor, at least in the Western Empire. Actually, it is unclear if Odovacar was of Goth descent, but he does seem to have had Germanic ethnicity. By this time, most of the Western Empire had been occupied by different groups of barbarians who were in the process of carving out their own kingdoms from the carcass of the Western Roman Empire. Still, it is important to emphasize that the barbarians did not destroy the empire. They merely strained the empire, which had been weakened by an endless succession of coups and civil wars. While the repeated barbarian invasions / armed migrations were the primary cause of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the key factor was the constant infighting at the top, especially the failure to create a smooth succession. The death of Constantius was probably the last chance for an orderly succession. Even so, Itius had made the best of a bad situation, and his policy of orderly barbarian settlement had limited the damage. It is unlikely that he could have reconquered all of Gaul or Hispania, and North Africa was far beyond his resources. But he could have preserved part of Gaul, basically Provence, and held part of Hispania. Combined with Italy and Dalmatia, the revenues could have funded an army that no single barbarian group could have opposed. But he was assassinated, which set off another round of destructive civil wars. Sadly, we don't have the exact numbers, but I suspect that more Roman soldiers died fighting other Roman soldiers than fighting barbarians. It is difficult to overstate the dramatic nature of Odovacar's decision to call himself king rather than attempt to become emperor. While it is hard to deny that there was no more Western empire, he rejected even the appearance of an empire. This action was a rejection of claims to Hispania and North Africa, and more important, a rejection of the authority of the Eastern emperor, who had become the senior emperor by this time. By the time that Romulus Augustus was deposed in 476, Gaul was divided among several kingdoms. The Goths held everything from the Loire Valley south, stretching into the Iberian Peninsula. The Burgundian kingdom was the upper and middle Rhone area. The northeast of Gaul, Frisia, basically the modern Netherlands, was controlled by the Franks. The rest belonged to what was left of Rome. Meanwhile, Goth armies had rampaged through Hispania until the Suebi were confined to the northwest corner. When Romulus was deposed, Euric quickly seized the last part of northeastern Hispania controlled by the empire. Euric likely gambled that Odovacar would not risk a war with the Goths. This gamble proved correct, since Euric was able to force Odovacar to hand over Provence in exchange for a promise to stay on his side of the Alps. Roughly 2 generations after the Goths had been given semi-autonomous rule in the region in 418, the Goths had become a kingdom, which reflected the failure of the Western Empire. While Odovacar enjoyed support among Italian landowners, or more accurately, there was no active opposition, his reign had started badly since he had surrendered Provence to Euric. However, Odovacar quickly forced the Vandals to vacate Sicily in exchange for an annual tribute. Many senators were unsurprisingly happy to regain their estates in Sicily, which had been lost a few years earlier, but more important, Italy now had a source of food supplies. Then he conquered Dalmatia in 480, so his kingdom was clearly expanding. In fact, Odovacar crossed the Danube in 487 to conquer the Rugi, barbarians who had settled in the region. However, the following year, Odovacar abandoned the region, ordering the evacuation of all Romans in the area. While Odovacar's reaction seems strange, he had likely learned that Zeno, the new Eastern Roman emperor, was talking with a barbarian leader named Theodoric about a move to a new neighborhood, his neighborhood. So he needed to focus on defending his lands, not expanding. To sum up, an army supplied by the Eastern Emperor ensured that Anthemius became Emperor of the Western Roman Empire, but a failed attempt to invade Carthage enabled Ricimer to regain control of the empire. Actually, the empire shrank since the Goths expanded their territory in Gaul and Hispania, while Ricimer and Anthemius were fighting each other. However, Ricimer died shortly after Anthemius was killed. There were 3 separate emperors between 472 and 475 until a general named Orestes seized power and made his teenage son Romulus emperor. A year later, another general named Odovacar defeated Orestes, but Odovacar seemed to accept that the Western Roman Empire no longer existed, since he announced that he was king of Italy, making Romulus the last Roman emperor. Odovacar may have decided to end the relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire, but the Eastern Emperor did not handle the breakup well. I will discuss the Emperor's reaction next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.